Students, this week we're talking about nationalism and how this movement develops after the War of 1812. So we're going to talk about nationalism. We're going to talk about the very influential presidency of Andrew Jackson. This is part of the same theme that I've explained is going to be really central to the class, the second half of this class. How to bring together, how to integrate these states into one nation. And as the United States continues to grow geographically, the question becomes less how do you integrate these states into a nation, but how do you integrate these different regions into a single nation? Increasingly, there are three quite different regions within the United States. The North, dominated by trade and industry. The West, dominated by farming. And the South, dominated by the cultivation of cotton. And the challenge is going to be integrating these three together when they have different identities to a certain extent and different priorities. How do you forge all three of these regions together into a single nation? For that reason, we're going to see people, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, we're going to see politicians who previously were much more aligned with someone like Thomas Jefferson and wanted to restrict the power of the federal government, start to move in a different direction, start to emphasize integrating these different parts of the country together. Politicians like Madison, Clay, Calhoun, all of these politicians would look to more fully integrate the different parts of the United States together, and to do so by increasing the role of the federal government in the lives of individual people and in the lives of the states. And so we see this in the creation of a second United States national bank designed to provide the stability that local state banks had not been able to provide. We see it in the creation of tariffs that is designed to protect the industries in New England by raising the prices on manufactured goods that are coming in from Britain and from Europe. So the tariffs protect these industries. The tariffs are set on a national level by the federal government. We see it in infrastructure spending, and that the federal government is spending money on roads, and railroads, and canals, as we saw last week, to bring this country together. And so the federal government is taking on roles that Democrats in a previous time, Republicans in a previous time, people like Thomas Jefferson probably would have recoiled at a little bit. And we also see this with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court passes three decisions in the period from 1819 to 1825, Dartmouth versus Woodward, McCulloch versus Maryland, and Gibbons versus Ogden, all of which assert the supremacy of the federal government over the rights of individual states. For example, in Gibbons versus Ogden, it's decreed that having a federal license to ship merchandise on a river, the Hudson River, supersedes a monopoly that was granted to one of your competitors by the state. That if you have a federal license, it doesn't matter. And that the federal government can grant you that license over the fact that the state has already declared a monopoly on that trade. And so this means that all these different branches of government, Senate, presidency, the judiciary, are all emphasizing integrating, to use the same phrase again, are all emphasizing integrating the different regions of the United States together using the authority of the federal government. Now, this period, the period after the War of 1812, was known as the era of good feelings. You only had one viable political party. Everyone was still caught up in the patriotic afterglow at the end of the War of 1812. And so that's why it's considered a period in which there was very little acrimony, political or cultural conflict or acrimony. And this period, this era of good feelings, is brought to an end by two events, the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise. Panic of 1819 is a result of banks, including the U.S. National Bank, that are overexposing themselves. They're caught up in this era of good feelings. They're lending recklessly. Once you see a decline in cotton and crop prices because of a crop spike in Europe in 1819, it means that they're no longer collecting payments on those loans, and the banks start to default. Debtors start to default on their loans. Banks start to default on their depositors. This creates a culture of suspicion about banks in parts of the United States, particularly in the West and in the South. Among rural farmers, banks start to be seen as an agent of foreign investors to get wealthy and then leave people hanging. So that's kind of the important long-term consequence of the Panic of 1812. The Panic of 1819 is that people lose confidence in the banks at the time. The second event that brings the era of good feelings to an end is the Missouri Compromise of 1819. In 1819, Missouri has reached the threshold that's necessary, the population threshold that's necessary to become a state. It applies for statehood. It would be the first state west of the Mississippi. And the population of Missouri at the time was about 60,000 whites and about 10,000 slaves. And a problem emerges because there had been statutes laid out or ordinances laid out at the end of the previous century, which had decreed that slavery would be illegal north of the Ohio River and that it would be still permitted south of the Ohio River. And Missouri kind of straddles the two, but most of Missouri is north of the Ohio River. But you already have a slave culture there. And so the initial approach of anti-slavery politicians from the North in Congress, when they received this petition for statehood, is to say we're going to allow you to become a state, but not to transport any new slaves into the region. And that in the long term, this would kill off slavery. This enrages Southern politicians. They're very concerned to maintain a balance and have an equal number of states that permit slavery and states that are opposed to slavery or where slavery is not permitted. They're worried that as soon as you have an imbalance one way or the other, either Southern politicians will start allowing slavery in Northern states, or Northern states will move to suppress slavery. And so the Missouri Compromise is to allow Missouri to be admitted into the Union as a state that permits slavery, but at the same time to admit Maine as a separate free state. And so that this would maintain the balance between slave and free states. The other condition that is agreed upon for Missouri to become a state admitted of the Union is that they have to allow free African Americans the rights of citizenship, because this was permitted in other states. So slavery is going to be permitted, but all the rights of citizenship will be granted to free African Americans within the state. And so people at the time, people like Madison and Clay and Calhoun, who were emphasizing nationalism, praised the compromise. They said, this is an unfortunate but necessary compromise in order to keep the nation together. And this was what they thought had happened. In reality, as we'll see going forward, what the Missouri Compromise does, why it's important, is that it hardens and concretizes and makes clear the real sectional differences that are starting to emerge within the United States. Differences between slave states and free states, between the North and between the South.